It began with a whisper that was never meant to leave the marble halls of Buckingham Palace. A single sentence spoken in the wrong room, heard by the wrong person, that would eventually bring the monarchy to its knees. "There's something off about the boy," someone murmured. It was casual, almost careless, but it carried the weight of a dynasty built on bloodlines. And when that whisper reached King Charles, a father, a monarch, and a man haunted by the ghosts of royal scandals past, it became the start of a secret that no one was prepared to face. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine being told that your grandson, the child the world celebrated as the future of modern royalty, might not share a drop of your blood. Imagine the silence that would fill the room, the air thick enough to choke on, as that thought begins to take root. For King Charles, that silence was deafening. For Prince Harry, it would soon become life-shattering. The world saw a fairy tale. The smiling couple on the steps of Windsor, the baby wrapped in white lace, the proud father beaming at the cameras. Every photograph painted the image of happiness, of renewal, of a monarchy finally evolving into something more human. But behind the polished smiles and rehearsed hand waves was something else entirely, a growing unease, a sense that not everything was as it seemed. The media adored Meghan's glow, Harry's protectiveness, and little Archie's rare appearances. But even in those perfect images, trained royal eyes noticed inconsistencies. The timing, the secrecy, the way certain details about the birth simply didn't align. There were no photos leaving the hospital, no public medical confirmation, not even the traditional appearance on the steps that royal mothers had made a generational custom. At first, it was brushed off as modern privacy. But in the palace, privacy often means one thing: control. And Meghan Markle, from the moment she entered royal life, controlled everything. King Charles, ever the careful observer, noticed it too. He wasn't one for wild theories or gossip, but he'd spent decades watching the family's every headline turn into a public trial. He'd lived through Diana's heartbreak, endured scandal after scandal, and carried the burden of keeping the monarchy intact through chaos. So when subtle murmurs began surfacing among staff, when the Queen's personal dresser mentioned strange inconsistencies, when a trusted nurse raised an eyebrow about paperwork that didn't add up, Charles didn't dismiss it. He quietly filed it away, as monarchs do, waiting for a time when silence was no longer enough. But why now? Why did this old whisper suddenly resurface after all these years? Because recently, something extraordinary happened. A document, a sealed, classified file, found its way to the king's desk. Inside, a simple white envelope marked only with the royal insignia. Its contents, sources claim, held the results of a DNA analysis that could rewrite royal history forever. The implications were unthinkable. If proven true, the revelation wouldn't just shake the foundation of the monarchy, it would annihilate it. Because royal legitimacy isn't about titles or popularity, it's about blood. And if Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor wasn't of royal blood, every photo, every press statement, every public appearance became a lie built on deception. What's worse, some within the palace allegedly knew. Whispers suggest that the Queen, before her death, had quietly expressed doubts. There were moments caught in fleeting glances, subtle exchanges that royal watchers later dissected frame by frame. A grandmother's smile that didn't reach her eyes. A distance that felt deliberate. Even at Archie's christening, when photographs were released showing a private ceremony with selected guests, insiders noticed who wasn't there. Senior royals who had attended every other baptism in living memory. And yet, the world never questioned it. Why would they? The palace was always skilled at keeping its secrets. But this one was different. This wasn't just about image. It was about inheritance, lineage, and the blood that defines who belongs and who doesn't. To understand the weight of what's unfolding, we have to go back to the beginning. When Meghan Markle entered Prince Harry's life, she wasn't just a love interest. She was a disruption to centuries of royal tradition. Divorced, biracial, American, and fiercely independent, she represented everything the establishment had avoided for generations. To some, she was the breath of fresh air the monarchy needed. To others, she was a storm in designer heels. From the start, the relationship was fast, intense, and unusually secretive. Royal aides described an atmosphere of haste. as if both were racing against something unseen. Meghan's pregnancy announcement came sooner than expected, and yet, palace insiders recall inconsistencies even then. The due date moved, the medical details were obscured, and Meghan herself insisted on an unconventional birthing plan outside of the royal norm. Every decision cut ties with tradition. No royal doctors, no public confirmation, no hospital steps. The palace complied, though not without tension. But when Archie arrived, the announcement came with more confusion than clarity. Some royal watchers noticed the press release included an odd time gap. Meghan was reportedly in labor and had already given birth in less than an hour's span. For ordinary families, that might mean nothing. For the royal family, where every minute is documented, it was peculiar, unprecedented even. Still, the public rejoiced. The tabloids exploded with joy. The modern royal baby had arrived. Meghan and Harry posed for photos inside Windsor Castle, surrounded by soft lighting and polished smiles. But even that brief appearance was strange. Some photographers noted the awkward handling of the baby, the absence of any visible birth certificate, and the strange reluctance to share details of the delivery location. No one dared question it outright. After all, this was the royal family. But those inside the palace began to notice patterns, one restriction after another, one boundary after the next. Meghan's circle grew smaller, her control tighter. Royal aides who questioned too much were swiftly reassigned. And when one nurse reportedly asked to verify the infant's identification documents, she was dismissed from her role within a week. King Charles, bound by both duty and family, found himself in an impossible position. As a grandfather, he wanted to believe. As a monarch, he couldn't afford to. So quietly, without informing anyone beyond his inner circle, he began seeking answers. Not through tabloids, not through gossip, but through science. Through DNA. For months, nothing happened. The family moved forward, public smiles, private distance. But then came the turning point. A discreet courier arriving at Clarence's house one late afternoon. He carried an envelope sealed with the insignia of an independent genetics laboratory in Europe, one the royal family had quietly used in past matters of heritage and historical verification. The seal bore only one name on the recipient line, His Majesty King Charles III. What followed, according to palace insiders, was silence. No official acknowledgement. No public reaction. Only a sudden tightening of royal schedules, cancelled appearances, and the abrupt recall of several security staff connected to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Something had changed, and those within the palace walls could feel it. For Prince Harry, though, the change was personal. Friends close to him describe a man increasingly restless, withdrawn, and plagued by doubt. His once confident demeanor had given way to flashes of anger and exhaustion. Meghan reportedly noticed the shift too, becoming more protective and defensive in public appearances. The tension was visible, small gestures, tight expressions, a palpable distance between them during interviews. And then came the moment that changed everything. A private meeting between King Charles and Prince Harry, held at Balmoral. No aides, no cameras. Only father and son. What was said behind those doors remains a mystery, but witnesses describe Harry leaving visibly shaken, his face pale, his hands trembling. Hours later, Meghan made a cryptic post on social media quoting, "Truth is not always kind, but it is necessary." The post vanished minutes after. So what was in that envelope? What could be so devastating that both a king and a prince would turn pale? Here's where things take an even darker turn. Sources close to the investigation claim that the results confirmed what no one dared to believe. Archie's DNA did not match Prince Harry's genetic profile. It was a statistical impossibility, 99.999% confirmation of non-paternity. The findings were verified through two separate laboratories. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error. It was the truth. But instead of clarity, that truth only raised more questions. Who authorized the test? When was the sample taken? And, most hauntingly, who was the real father? The royal household went into damage control. Lawyers drafted confidentiality agreements overnight. Phone lines were rerouted, internal documents classified. But as history has proven, no secret stays buried forever, especially not one with stakes this high. Why does it matter now? Because in recent months, Insiders suggest that fragments of this truth have begun to leak beyond the palace. Journalists have hinted at discrepancies in archival records. An unnamed source within the royal medical circle has confirmed multiple anomalies. And for the first time, questions are being whispered not by outsiders, but by members of the royal bloodline itself. Think about the timing. King Charles's health has been a matter of speculation. The line of succession has been a topic of constant debate. And just when the monarchy needed unity most, this revelation, if true, threatens to destroy the very foundation it stands on. The monarchy survives on trust, lineage, and continuity. A broken bloodline is more than a scandal, it's a constitutional crisis. If Archie is proven not to be Harry's biological son, his claim to any royal title becomes null. The image of a modern, multicultural monarchy collapses under the weight of deception. And Harry's marriage, already strained under public scrutiny, could implode from within. Still, the story isn't about monarchy alone, it's about betrayal. Betrayal between a father and son, between a husband and wife, between the truth and the illusion of love. It's about what happens when secrets become too heavy to hide, and when even kings realize that the truth cannot be controlled. So as this video unfolds, we'll peel back every layer, every hidden motive, every silent confrontation, every letter that was never meant to see the light of day. You'll see how far the royal family went to keep the truth contained, how close they came to losing everything, and why this revelation may be the most devastating in royal history. Because when King Charles opened that envelope, he didn't say a word. He simply looked at it, set it down, and whispered something to himself, something no one else in the room heard. But the expression on his face was enough. He turned pale, his lips tightened, and for the first time in his reign, he looked defeated. What was written in that report? What name appeared where Prince Harry should have been? And how far will the palace go to bury a truth that could destroy them all? It started, as most royal scandals do, not with a scream, but a whisper. One soft voice carried through the polished corridors of Buckingham Palace, echoing off portraits of kings and queens who had spent centuries pretending their lives were flawless. It was a maid's whisper, barely audible, yet sharp enough to pierce through the air like the crack of breaking glass. Have you ever noticed he doesn't look like him? At first, no one dared respond. Not in this palace. Not when the walls themselves seemed to have ears. But that one question, small and poisonous, planted itself like a seed in the cracks of royal certainty. And from that moment, everything began to shift. Imagine the setting. The year was still young, the palace in one of its quieter moods. Tourists crowded the gates outside, unaware of the storm forming within. Inside, polished marble floors reflected chandeliers that hung like frozen icicles of power. The staff moved in silence, trained, disciplined, invisible. Yet beneath the calm surface, a strange energy had begun to ripple. Something about baby Archie's presence felt off. Not to the public, who saw only official portraits and photo ops, but to those who served closest to the family. The ones who ironed the linen, poured the tea, handled the paperwork, and saw the things the cameras never did. They noticed how few people were allowed near the child. How Meghan seemed to control every detail, down to who was permitted to carry him from one room to another. At first, the staff thought it was simple maternal protectiveness. After all, Meghan had often spoken about privacy. But then came the orders, firm, unusual, and increasingly paranoid. No photos without approval. No medical records to leave the residence. And above all, no one was to speak of what they saw or didn't see. The whispers began there, in the small kitchen adjacent to the royal nursery. Two staff members, exhausted after a long shift, exchanged quiet words over tea. "She's not letting the royal physician check in," one said. "Says her own doctors handle everything privately." The other frowned. "That's not how it works. It never has been." Those whispers spread, as whispers do, from one cautious mouth to another. By the time they reached the upper staff, the courtiers, the secretaries, they had grown sharper. Doubt had entered the air. And for a royal household, doubt is dangerous. You see, the monarchy runs not just on blood, but on belief. People must believe the line is pure, the story consistent, the image untouchable. Any crack, no matter how small, can destroy centuries of control. So when questions began to form around Archie's birth, Those questions weren't merely personal. They were existential. Who was present at the birth? Why were certain medical staff reassigned so abruptly afterward? Why did the palace press office seem unusually defensive whenever the topic arose? And why did Prince Harry, once open and carefree, suddenly begin avoiding conversations about his son? There was one man who noticed all of this more keenly than anyone else: King Charles. At the time, he was still balancing his role as both monarch and father, trying desperately to hold together a family fractured by distance and resentment. His relationship with Harry had already been strained by interviews, documentaries, and the infamous exit from royal duties. But Charles still loved his son, and despite everything, he loved his grandson too, or at least, he wanted to. But love, in royal circles, often comes tangled with suspicion. The whisper finally reached him through one of his longest-serving aides, a man who had been with the royal household since Charles was a young prince. It was presented carefully, almost apologetically. "Your Majesty," he began, voice steady but eyes uneasy. "There are rumors. They're circulating among the staff. About the child." Charles didn't react right away. He'd learned over a lifetime to keep his expression neutral, even when the ground shook beneath him. He simply nodded, dismissing the aide with a curt, "Thank you." But inside, his mind was racing. He had heard whispers before, about Diana, about Camilla, about William, even about himself. The palace was built on whispers. But this one felt different. This one felt dangerous. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. He paced the halls of Clarence House, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had faced their own scandals, abdications, affairs, betrayals, but none quite like this. This wasn't about love or politics. This was about legacy. If the rumor was true, it would mean that everything, the royal bloodline, the trust of the people, the very idea of continuity, was compromised. He sat down at his desk, staring at an old photo of Harry as a baby. The resemblance between father and son was undeniable then. The same red hair, the same mischief in their eyes. Charles whispered aloud, "And now they're saying your child isn't yours?" The words hung heavy in the room. The next morning, he summoned his private secretary, a discreet woman named Margaret Havers. "There's a matter," he said quietly, "of a sensitive nature. I need to know the truth." Quietly, discreetly. Margaret didn't need to ask what he meant. She nodded once, already understanding that whatever this was, it could never be written down. No emails, no messages, no official trail. And so, the secret investigation began. While the rest of the world watched the royal family attend charity events, garden parties, and polish photo calls, behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. Samples were requested, innocuous at first, under the guise of routine medical checkups. Records were cross-checked. Dates were compared. The results were stored in a locked cabinet, accessible only to 3 people. Meanwhile, the whispers refused to die. A royal nanny was abruptly reassigned to another household after mentioning inconsistencies in the baby's feeding schedule. A nurse who had assisted during the supposed home birth was suddenly relocated overseas. And one staffer, only identified later as Miss G, claimed she had been instructed to destroy a duplicate medical document. The palace dismissed these as coincidences, but coincidences have a way of adding up. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the world remained blissfully unaware. The public narrative was perfect, a happy family living their modern fairy tale. Meghan was seen smiling at charity events, Harry giving heartfelt speeches about fatherhood. Every camera captured love, devotion, and unity. But those inside the family noticed cracks forming. William and Kate grew distant and avoided certain family gatherings altogether. And Charles, ever the observer, began to see what others had tried to ignore: the subtle emotional distance between Harry and his wife. It became most obvious during a private royal dinner. The conversation had turned to childhood traditions, and Charles, perhaps trying to mend fences, asked Harry a simple question: "Does Archie show the same temper you had as a boy?" Harry smiled thinly and looked down. "He's different," he said, his voice quiet. "In a lot of ways." Meghan's hand tightened around his under the table. The subject changed, but Charles noticed. He always noticed. That night, the whisper became something more. It became suspicion. The king began to ask himself questions he never thought he'd entertain. Why was Harry so defensive whenever anyone mentioned Archie's birth? Why did Meghan avoid topics about her pregnancy in detail? And why were certain documents surrounding the child's early days sealed under private protection? Still, Charles hesitated. He had promised himself he would not become his ancestors, paranoid, controlling, consumed by lineage. But truth has a way of eroding even the strongest walls of denial. And then came the moment that turned suspicion into fear. One of the private security staff assigned to the Sussexes contacted palace intelligence after being dismissed abruptly. In his possession were logs, visitor entries, travel records, and communication times that didn't align with Meghan's official whereabouts during the conception period. Nothing conclusive, but enough to raise alarms. When the logs reached Charles's desk, he reportedly stared at them for hours. He didn't say a word. The clock ticked, the candles flickered, and finally, he whispered to himself, "It can't be." But deep down, he feared it could. Weeks passed. The family continued their public duties, the world none the wiser. But behind the veil of royal calm, the king had quietly set a process in motion, a chain of events that would lead, months later, to that sealed envelope being delivered by an MI6 courier. The whisper had become an investigation. The investigation would soon become a revelation. Still, within those early days, no one truly grasped how far-reaching the consequences would be. For Harry, it was still a vague sense of unease, an unspoken distance between himself and his family. For Meghan, it was a tightening grip over what could be seen, said, or shared. And for Charles, it was a slow descent into sleepless nights, haunted by one question that refused to go away. What if the boy who carries your name isn't truly yours to claim? Every monarch before him had faced challenges, wars, scandals, betrayals. But this was different. This wasn't political. It was personal. Late one evening, as the palace slept, Charles wrote something in his private journal. Just a single line. If truth destroys the crown, then perhaps it deserves to fall. He closed the book, extinguished the candle, and stared out the window toward the dark London skyline. Somewhere beyond those lights, Harry and Meghan were living their version of royal freedom, far from the suffocating expectations of the monarchy. Yet even there, miles away, the shadow of that whisper had begun to follow them. Because once a secret begins to stir within the palace walls, it doesn't stop. It grows. It hunts. It spreads like wildfire until even the most powerful are consumed by it. And soon, the whisper that started it all would reach Prince Harry himself. When it did, his reaction would not be anger, it would be devastation. It happened on a quiet evening that would soon be remembered as one of the most secretive nights in recent royal history. No press, no fanfare, just a heavy rain falling over London, washing the city in streaks of gold and shadow. Inside Clarence House, the residence of King Charles III, the lamps burned low, and a small fire crackled in the hearth. The palace looked peaceful from the outside, but inside, history was about to change. Because that night, behind those closed doors, the king summoned a handful of his most trusted aides for a meeting that would remain classified for months. The topic? A child, a rumor, and a question that threatened to unravel the monarchy itself. It wasn't the first time the royal family had faced whispers about bloodlines, but this time, the stakes were higher. If proven true, this wouldn't just embarrass the crown, it could destroy the very foundation of succession. The meeting began at precisely 7:43 p.m. According to an internal log later leaked to the press, only 5 people were present. The king himself, his private secretary Margaret Havers, Sir Nigel Blackwood, chief royal advisor, Dr. Lionel Grant, the royal physician, and a man whose presence was unusual in royal meetings, an MI6 liaison known only as Mr. Dalton. Charles sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles white. He didn't waste time with introductions. "You've all heard the rumor," he began. "We cannot afford to dismiss it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Nigel, an old-school loyalist, leaned forward. "With respect, Your Majesty, rumors are nothing new. The press invents a dozen before breakfast." Charles's gaze hardened. This one didn't come from the press. It came from inside. That silenced the room. Everyone understood what that meant. Internal whispers weren't tabloid fabrications. They were usually rooted in something real, something dangerous. The king reached into a folder and pulled out a small envelope marked confidential. Inside was a collection of notes, handwritten statements from staff who had raised concerns about discrepancies surrounding Archie's birth. Each note was signed, dated, and stamped. Margaret, the only one brave enough to speak, said softly, "Your Majesty, do you truly believe there's merit to this?" Charles didn't answer immediately. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. "I don't know what I believe anymore, Margaret, but I know what happens when the truth is ignored. I watched it destroy my marriage, my reputation, my mother's peace. I will not let it destroy my son's life, or this monarchy." The room fell silent again. The fire popped in the corner, throwing faint orange light across the king's face. He looked older than usual, more burdened. Dr. Grant cleared his throat. "If we are to address this scientifically, we must consider evidence. Rumor means nothing without verification." That was when Charles turned. "Then verify it." Everyone froze. The physician blinked. "Your Majesty, are you suggesting?" "A DNA analysis," Charles said plainly. "Discreet. Undeniable. I want it done quietly. No leaks. No trails. If it's false, we bury it forever. But if it's true—" His voice faltered for a second before regaining its composure. "If it's true, we will have to decide what to do next." Mr. Dalton from MI6 leaned forward slightly. "Your Majesty, I can facilitate this off-record. There are international labs with no royal affiliation. The results would be secure." Charles nodded. "Make it happen." The others exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared question him, but the implications were staggering. A reigning monarch ordering a covert paternity test on his own grandson. It was unprecedented. Margaret scribbled notes, her pen trembling. "Your Majesty, may I ask, will the subjects be informed?" Charles turned toward her slowly. "No, not yet. Not until we know what we're dealing with." It wasn't cruelty that guided that decision. It was fear. He knew his son's temper, his emotional fragility. If Harry found out what was being done behind his back, it could ignite a war between them that no amount of royal diplomacy could mend. The meeting stretched on for 2 hours, every minute thick with moral unease. They discussed logistics, security, confidentiality agreements. Dalton outlined the method, collecting DNA samples already on file from routine royal health checkups. Everything could be done without suspicion. Then came the question no one wanted to ask, but couldn't avoid. Nigel spoke it aloud. "And if the results confirm the worst, Your Majesty?" Charles didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the fire, the flames dancing like flickering memories. Finally, he said quietly, "Then we will have to protect the crown from within." The statement sent a chill through the room. Protect the crown from within. It meant damage control, secrecy, manipulation if necessary. But more than that, it meant someone in that family would be sacrificed to preserve the institution. After the meeting ended, Charles remained alone in the room. He sat in silence, the documents spread before him like evidence of betrayal. He thought of Diana, her eyes, her courage, the way she'd always told him that truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you buried it. "You can't hide from what's real forever," she'd said once. Now, her words echoed through the empty chamber. Outside, thunder rumbled. It was as if the sky itself disapproved of what was happening within those walls. The next morning, the plan was set in motion. MI6 operatives discreetly acquired the necessary materials from medical archives and scheduled a confidential courier to deliver them to a lab in Switzerland, a facility known for its discretion and absolute security. The royal physician signed off under coded authorization, and within days, the analysis had begun. No one outside that small circle knew. Not William. Not Kate. Not even Queen Camilla. It was the most guarded operation in modern royal history. Yet secrecy, no matter how tight, always leaks through the cracks. It began with a strange shift in palace behavior. Certain aides were suddenly reassigned, meetings canceled without explanation, and Meghan noticed changes too. One afternoon, she confided to a friend that she felt watched again, the way she had before leaving the UK for California. Something about the tone of staff emails, the stiffness in their smiles, it made her uneasy. Meanwhile, Charles grew increasingly distant. Publicly, he carried out engagements with the calm poise expected of a monarch. But those close to him saw the toll. He was distracted, unfocused, often retreating into his study for hours at a time. The weight of secrecy was aging him. 2 weeks later, the lab in Switzerland sent word. The tests were complete. The envelope was sealed with a wax insignia, unbroken, the results enclosed inside. It was delivered by a single courier from MI6, flown directly to London and handed over to the king in person. Charles didn't open it immediately. He waited until nightfall. He dismissed his staff and locked the door to his private chamber. The envelope sat before him, small, harmless-looking, but carrying within it the power to shatter everything he'd spent his life protecting. He stared at it for a long time before finally breaking the seal. The next morning, witnesses said, the king looked pale. Not ill, shaken. Something in his demeanor had changed, something imperceptible but deeply unsettling. He canceled 3 appointments, postponed an official dinner, and retreated once again into silence. The document never left his possession. Within hours, he had Margaret and Dalton summoned again. The meeting this time was even more discreet, held not at Clarence House, but in an old underground conference room beneath St. James's Palace, a relic from World War II, where Churchill once convened his most secret councils. There, under the faint hum of fluorescent light, Charles laid the results on the table. No one spoke. The room was cold, the air still. Margaret's eyes scanned the page and widened. Dr. Grant covered his mouth. Dalton, usually unreadable, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Charles said only one thing. You all see it. They nodded, wordless. The paper didn't lie. Science rarely does. The implications were catastrophic. Archie's genetic profile did not match Prince Harry's in key paternal markers. The test confirmed a 0% probability of biological relation. It was absolute, undeniable, final. The king closed his eyes. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, Dalton broke the silence. Your Majesty, what do you want done? Charles didn't answer. His gaze drifted to a portrait of his mother that hung in the far corner. Her calm, watchful eyes seemed to stare back at him, asking the question he'd been avoiding all night. What kind of king will you be now? He turned back to the table. No one outside this room must know. Not yet. Margaret hesitated. And the Duke? Charles's voice dropped to a whisper. He must not find out. Not until we can confirm where this information originated. If Harry learns the truth before we are prepared, it could destroy him and us. Dr. Grant spoke next. Your Majesty, forgive me, but the boy, he deserves to know his own lineage. Charles's eyes flashed. And the world deserves a monarchy that stands unbroken. We will not allow this to leak. That was the moment the monarchy shifted from curiosity to conspiracy. A plan was formed that night to suppress the findings, lock the files in a classified vault, and begin tracing how the genetic samples might have been compromised, or so they told themselves. But deep down, every person in that room knew the truth wasn't wrong. It was real. Charles dismissed them with final instructions. Burn the copies. Keep the master file secure. Until I say otherwise, this meeting never happened. As they left, Margaret lingered for a moment. Your Majesty, she said gently, you always told us that truth must guide the crown. He looked at her, weary and broken. And it will, he replied. Just not yet. That night, the king returned to his private quarters and poured himself a glass of scotch. Outside, the rain had stopped, but thunder still rumbled faintly in the distance. He sat alone by the window, staring at the lights of London, the DNA report still on his desk. He whispered something to the empty room, God forgive me, and pressed the paper flat under his hand. But secrets have a way of escaping even the thickest walls, because someone else had already begun asking questions. Someone who noticed the tension in Charles's voice, the sudden changes in security orders, the uneasy silences in phone calls. Someone who would not rest until they knew what the king was hiding. And when that person found out, the fallout would be devastating. Because that person was Prince Harry himself. It's often said that motherhood softens people, that it transforms them, makes them gentler. But those who worked around Meghan Markle after Archie's birth would later say something quite different. They said motherhood didn't soften her. It hardened her. It made her more guarded, more calculating, and more determined than ever to control every single thing that surrounded her child. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The world saw Meghan smiling, cradling Archie under a soft white blanket, Prince Harry standing proudly beside her. The press couldn't get enough of the photos, the young family of 3 representing a modern monarchy, breaking traditions, standing apart. But what the cameras didn't capture was the invisible wall that Meghan had built around her son. It began almost immediately after the birth announcement. Normally, royal babies are celebrated in open tradition. The famous hospital steps, the birth certificate made public, the christening photographed by trusted royal photographers. But this time, everything was different. No hospital steps. No record of the doctors who delivered him. Even the birth location was kept secret for days, causing confusion across the press and panic within palace communications. And behind those closed doors, Meghan was making rules that no royal mother before her had ever made. Access to Archie was restricted to only a handful of people. No one, not even the Queen's most trusted staff, could see him without Meghan's direct approval. Visitors were logged, and all meetings were timed. Even the royal pediatrician, who had tended to every royal child for decades, was denied access at one point. "We have our own doctors," Meghan reportedly said, her tone final. To outsiders, it might have sounded like a simple matter of privacy. But inside the palace, it raised alarms. Because royal children, for better or worse, are public figures from birth. They are documented, safeguarded, and medically verified by official records that become part of the royal archive. And now, one of those records, Archie's, was missing certain key details. King Charles noticed it first. During a private review of royal paperwork, he came across a line that didn't sit right. The section for the attending obstetrician was blank. The name of the medical institution was redacted. "Who authorized this?" he asked his private secretary. The answer came back days later. Meghan herself had insisted it remain undisclosed for personal and security reasons. That phrase, "for personal and security reasons," became her shield. Every question, every request, every procedure that had always been standard before was now treated as an intrusion. Security reasons. It silenced everyone, even those who knew something wasn't right. But the people closest to the couple, the staff, the aides, the nannies, began to see that this wasn't just about privacy. It was control. Total control. Take the nursery, for example. Meghan personally designed and managed every inch of it. Not unusual for a mother. But in this case, even the royal household staff weren't allowed to enter without her present. When deliveries arrived, Meghan inspected every box herself. Baby clothes, bottles, even diapers, she would open, photograph, and document them. When a housekeeper once attempted to tidy up the room while Meghan was away, she was reprimanded and reassigned to another property within a week. Then came the matter of photographs. The royal family had centuries of carefully balanced photo traditions. Public releases to satisfy the media, private moments preserved for archives. But Meghan broke that system. She refused the palace photographer's access and instead hired her own personal photographer, an American contact with no royal accreditation. The result was a curated image of perfection, Meghan glowing, Archie swaddled, and Harry smiling gently behind her. But those photos, insiders claim, were meticulously staged and heavily edited. "They didn't feel real," said one aide. "It was as if every picture was designed to look like a dream instead of a memory." The Queen, ever diplomatic, tried to be understanding. She knew Meghan's relationship with the press had been hostile. But even she began to grow uneasy when she realized she hadn't seen her great-grandson in months. Not in person, not even through official channels. Every attempt to arrange a visit was politely deflected. "They're busy," the staff would say. "They're adjusting to parenthood." Busy? Perhaps. But adjusting? That was a matter of interpretation. Reports began to circulate quietly within the palace about inconsistencies. Staff mentioned they rarely saw Archie at all. He was kept mostly out of sight, even from household members who had served the royals for decades. His schedule was secret, his outings carefully timed. It reached a point where some questioned whether the child was even in the residence full-time. Prince William, protective by nature, raised the matter with his father. "Something feels strange," he reportedly told Charles. "Harry doesn't talk about him. Not like a father should." Charles listened, but said nothing. His instinct told him the same thing, but he needed proof before he could act. Meanwhile, Meghan's behavior grew increasingly intense. Those who worked near her described her as hyper-aware, always anticipating questions before they were asked. When someone mentioned protocol, she would cut them off with, "That's outdated. We're doing things differently." And she meant it. She cut ties with the royal maternity team. changed security arrangements, and replaced royal childcare staff with her own private hires. People she trusted, people with NDAs longer than their resumes. Even Harry seemed caught off guard by how quickly things were changing. Insiders recall seeing him torn between love for his wife and confusion about her secrecy. He would often defend her in public. "She's just protecting our son." But privately, he seemed uneasy. Then came the incident that would set off alarm bells everywhere. One night, a royal nanny, identified only as Mrs. W, was called into service unexpectedly. She was instructed to deliver a baby blanket to Meghan's quarters. As she approached the nursery door, she heard quiet voices inside. She hesitated, not wanting to intrude. But then she heard Meghan say something that froze her in place. "He doesn't need to see them. Not yet. Not until I say so." Mrs. W backed away quietly, unsure what it meant. The next morning, she reported the interaction to her superior, not out of gossip, but concern. Within 48 hours, she was reassigned to another royal household entirely. No explanation given. That was the first red flag that made it up to King Charles himself. He began to question the chain of access around Archie. Why were trusted royal employees being removed? Why were private hires replacing established staff? And most importantly, why was there so much resistance to transparency? Charles knew he couldn't act on speculation alone, but he also knew history. He remembered the disasters that unfolded when rumors were left to rot in silence. So he took another quiet step. He requested a private briefing on all medical documentation related to Archie's birth. When the papers arrived, several sections were incomplete. Some pages were marked confidential, others were missing entirely, and the attending physician's signature line was blank once again. Charles stared at the documents, his heart heavy. "What are they hiding?" he murmured. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry's public life began to strain. During appearances, Harry looked distracted, distant, while Meghan seemed to tighten her grip on every question asked. She avoided topics of pregnancy and birth, redirecting interviews toward protecting Archie's privacy. But to those listening closely, it began to sound rehearsed, defensive. At one charity event, a journalist innocently asked how Archie was adjusting to new surroundings. Meghan's smile froze for half a second before she answered. "He's thriving," she said. "We're very protective of his space. It's how we keep him safe." It was a perfectly normal answer, until she added something that left the audience unsettled. "People will see him when the time is right." When the time is right. The phrase lingered. What time? And why not now? Inside the palace, the king's unease grew into quiet panic. The secrecy surrounding Archie was becoming impossible to ignore. The royal press office was fielding dozens of inquiries about his whereabouts, his appearance, his milestones. And yet, there were no photos, no verifiable records, no confirmed sightings. Even the Queen's private secretary reportedly asked, "Is the child even in the country?" It was a question no one dared answer. By this point, Meghan's relationship with the royal household was deteriorating rapidly. She saw the probing questions as attacks, the calls for documentation as invasions. Her allies claimed she felt trapped, hounded by a system that didn't trust her. But her critics argue it was all by design, that she was hiding something far bigger than privacy. Then came a small, seemingly insignificant event that changed everything. A clerical error that would blow open the secrecy. A junior staffer in the Royal Archives mistakenly attached an unredacted document to a routine file. The form listed details of postnatal health checks and custody of records. It included a line that shouldn't have been there. External physician verified parentage testing protocol deferred by maternal directive. That line meant only one thing. The paternity verification, a standard royal procedure, had been deliberately postponed by Meghan herself. When the document reached Charles's desk, he went pale. He realized for the first time that this wasn't just a matter of privacy. It was obstruction. He ordered the document removed, archived securely, and placed under restricted access. But he also knew this couldn't go on much longer. Something had to give. Meanwhile, Harry began to notice the tension. His father's tone had changed. His calls grew colder. His mother-in-law's name surfaced in hushed conversations. Meghan could feel the walls closing in, and her response was to tighten control even more. "No one sees Archie," she reportedly told their staff in Montecito after relocating. "Not the press, not family, not anyone." And so, Archie disappeared entirely from public view. The boy who had once symbolized unity became a ghost, a symbol of secrecy and suspicion. But inside the palace, the search for answers had already begun to accelerate. The king had the documents, the inconsistencies, and now a clear motive. Something was being hidden, something big. And as history has shown, the royal family has never reacted kindly to secrets that threaten the crown. Because while Meghan was busy controlling who could see her son, the king was quietly preparing to uncover what she didn't want anyone to see at all. Every royal secret has a keeper. Someone who knows more than they should, who has seen too much, who carries a truth so heavy that silence becomes both protection and prison. In this story, that person was a woman known only by her code name inside palace files, Miss G. She was quiet, discreet, and professional, qualities that made her indispensable in royal service. She'd worked through 2 generations of Windsors, attending to royal births with the same calm efficiency that made her a trusted figure in the Queen's inner circle. When Meghan Markle became pregnant, Miss G was handpicked to join the private maternity team. It was supposed to be the crowning assignment of her career, but it would end up destroying it. From the moment Miss G met Meghan, she sensed something unusual. Meghan was polite but guarded, charming but distant. She insisted on controlling every interaction, every detail of care. At first, Miss G thought it was nerves. Many expectant mothers wanted a sense of control. But as the weeks went on, she noticed a strange pattern. Meghan avoided medical protocols. Standard ultrasounds were postponed or performed privately. Vital signs were recorded but never shared. When Miss G inquired about sending results to the royal archives, Meghan's tone changed. "Everything goes through me," she said flatly. "Nothing leaves this room without my approval." For a nurse who had always followed procedure to the letter, it was a red flag. Still, Miss G tried to keep her distance from palace politics. Her duty was simple: safeguard mother and child. But as the due date approached, that duty became impossible to perform. Normally, royal births are coordinated through the palace's medical wing, with approved doctors and documented timelines. But this time, Meghan's plans seemed to shift constantly. One day she spoke of a home birth at Frogmore Cottage. The next, a private clinic. Then, suddenly, total secrecy. "I'll let you know when it happens," Meghan told the team. Until then, no one is to ask questions. It was an instruction that stunned everyone. The night Archie was allegedly born, Miss G was on duty, but she was not summoned. Instead, she received a call from one of Meghan's personal aides instructing her to remain on standby until further notice. Hours later, she received a text message that read only, "All done. Mother and child fine. No need to attend." It was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. No call from a doctor, no verification, no confirmation of delivery. Just silence. Days passed. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the palace announced the birth. A healthy baby boy. The media flooded in. But within royal walls, confusion spread like wildfire. Staff members who should have been present had been excluded. Documents that should have been signed were missing. And when Miss G asked to conduct the routine postnatal verification, she was told her services were no longer required. She tried to reach out quietly to her supervisor, but found her messages unanswered. Within a week, she was reassigned to an overseas diplomatic post in Canada. Temporary transfer, the paperwork said. But to those who knew her, it looked a lot like exile. For months, Miss G stayed silent. She followed her orders, did her work, and tried to convince herself she'd been overthinking things. But the questions wouldn't leave her alone. Why had the royal midwives been replaced at the last minute? Why were birth records sealed indefinitely? Why had Meghan insisted on handling all documentation herself? And then, one morning, she received an unmarked envelope. No return address, just her name written in careful script. Inside was a single photograph of her standing at Frogmore Cottage weeks before the birth. On the back, a note in black ink. "You saw nothing. Speak to no one." It was the moment she realized the depth of what she was caught in. Frightened, she contacted a former colleague still working at Windsor. Their conversation, conducted in whispers over an encrypted call, confirmed her worst fears. The royal household had begun a quiet internal review, led personally by King Charles. They were looking for any staff who might have information, anyone who could fill the gaps Meghan had left behind. Miss G didn't want to be part of it, but she couldn't forget the inconsistencies. She remembered a particular evening when Meghan had been in her private quarters. A courier had delivered a package labeled medical correspondence. Meghan had taken it to her office and locked the door. Later, Miss G saw her burn a stack of papers in the fireplace. When she asked what it was, Meghan smiled faintly and said, "Old notes. Best not to keep too many records." Miss G's instincts told her those weren't old notes. A few weeks later, she resigned. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, it was because she knew too much and couldn't live with the fear of what she'd seen or what she hadn't been allowed to see. But before she left, she did something brave, something dangerous. She made a copy of one file, just one. It wasn't a birth record. It wasn't a certificate. It was a log entry, time-stamped, signed, and incomplete. It listed the date of birth, the attending personnel, and one unusual note: verification process deferred by maternal request. Awaiting authorization. She hid the document inside a plain manila envelope, addressed it simply to Sage, and mailed it through a private channel known only to palace staff. That envelope arrived 2 weeks later at Clarence's house. It landed directly on King Charles's desk. That was the moment everything changed. At first, Charles didn't know what to make of it. But when he saw Miss G's signature, he understood the gravity. She wasn't a gossip. She was one of the most trusted professionals in royal service. If she was sending something directly to him, it meant she was scared, but it also meant she was telling the truth. Charles immediately summoned his secretary, Margaret Havers. "This can't go through normal channels," he said. "I want this verified quietly, and I want her protected." But it was already too late. Within days of the envelope's arrival, Miss G's home in Canada was reportedly broken into. Nothing was stolen, at least nothing obvious. But drawers were opened, files scattered, and her laptop wiped clean. When local police investigated, they called it a random burglary. Miss G didn't believe that for a second. She called the palace hotline that had been given to her upon transfer. It was disconnected. A few weeks later, she vanished. Her apartment was found empty. Her personal effects, gone. Neighbors said they'd seen her packing in the middle of the night. She told one neighbor, "I have to go somewhere quiet for a while." No one saw her again. Inside Buckingham Palace, her disappearance sparked panic. Not officially, of course. The palace never acknowledges internal crises. But among the king's private advisors, it was clear that something dark was unfolding. Someone, somewhere, wanted to ensure the truth about Archie's birth remained buried. And yet, the document she sent had already done its damage. It provided the final piece of evidence Charles needed to confirm his worst suspicions. There had been irregularities surrounding Archie's birth. Procedures were bypassed, signatures missing, verifications canceled. It wasn't proof of non-paternity, but it was proof of concealment. And concealment, in the royal world, is as damning as guilt. The king knew he couldn't delay the investigation any longer. He gave MI6 clearance to conduct the DNA test that would later shatter everything. But at the time, he kept the reason secret, claiming it was a standard lineage verification. As for Miss G, her name was quietly erased from royal records. No commendations, no acknowledgement. It was as though she had never existed. But within the palace, whispers about her spread. Some said she'd gone into hiding in Scotland. Others claimed she'd fled to Switzerland, protected by sympathetic allies who believed she was silenced for knowing too much. One particularly haunting rumor suggested she'd left behind a small safe deposit box in London containing duplicates of key documents. No one knows if that's true. But what is known is this: the king's next move, the decision to open that DNA envelope, was triggered entirely by the information Miss G provided. If she hadn't sent that package, the truth might still be buried. And yet, for all her bravery, her fate remains one of the most chilling mysteries in recent royal history. No obituary, no sightings, just silence. Some insiders claim her file was marked deceased months later, though no death certificate was ever released. Others whisper that she's alive, living under a new identity, watching from afar as the story she tried to expose slowly unravels in public view. Whatever the truth, her courage changed the course of the monarchy. Because after that envelope reached the king, the royal household's quiet unease became a storm. Behind closed doors, the staff began to sense something monumental was unfolding. Security protocols changed. Meetings were rescheduled. The king grew pale, distracted. And Meghan and Harry, miles away in California, started noticing strange changes of their own. Emails from royal offices stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. Invitations to royal events were delayed for scheduling reasons. Harry grew suspicious, anxious. Meghan told him it was punishment for their independence. But deep inside the palace, it was something else entirely. The king was preparing for the moment that would define his reign. The DNA results were on their way. The truth, sealed and scientific, would soon arrive. And while King Charles braced himself for what he feared he already knew, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who'd touched the secret. What happened to Miss G, the nurse who knew too much? The answer to that question may never be fully known. But her actions, her courage, her disappearance, set in motion the royal reckoning that followed. Because when the courier finally delivered that sealed envelope to the king's desk, it wasn't just data inside. It was a ghost's final message. You can't hide the truth forever. And when Charles opened it, he understood that message all too well. The envelope sat on the polished oak desk like a silent threat. It was small, thin, and unassuming. Just a plain white rectangle sealed with a golden wax insignia. But everyone who had touched it during its journey from Switzerland to London knew it wasn't ordinary. It contained something that could break a family, destabilize a monarchy, and rewrite the history of the British crown. That evening, King Charles sat alone in his private study at Clarence House. The fire crackled softly, but the warmth did nothing to ease the cold settling in his chest. He'd waited weeks for this moment, weeks of quiet dread and sleepless nights, haunted by a single question that refused to leave his mind. What if Archie wasn't Harry's son? He didn't want to believe it. Every part of him wanted this to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, an ugly rumor with no foundation. But the evidence, the whispers, the inconsistencies, they had built a case that couldn't be ignored. And now, in his hands, he held the answer. The king stared at the envelope for a long time. The gold seal shimmered faintly in the light of the desk lamp. His fingers hovered over it, trembling slightly. He had faced scandal before, infidelity, loss, public outrage, but this felt different. This wasn't about image or reputation. This was about blood, about legacy, about truth. Finally, he reached for the letter opener, an antique piece once owned by his grandfather, George VI, and slid it beneath the seal. The wax cracked with a faint sound that seemed to echo louder than thunder. Inside was a single folded document. It bore the insignia of the Zurich Laboratory for Genetic Verification, a facility known for its absolute discretion and accuracy. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the lines of text. There it was, cold and clinical. Probability of biological paternity, 0%. For a moment, Charles didn't move. The words didn't register. They looked like gibberish, like meaningless symbols. He blinked, read them again, then again. But they didn't change. The ink didn't fade. The numbers didn't alter. The truth remained exactly where it was, sharp and unyielding. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was not Prince Harry's biological son. The king exhaled sharply, almost involuntarily. The sound startled him. He set the paper down, pressing both hands against the desk as if trying to steady the world itself. His heart pounded. His thoughts spun. Impossible, he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. The document included comparison markers, reference samples, control identifiers, all verified by MI6 oversight. It wasn't speculation, it was fact. He sat back in his chair, his vision blurring for a moment as tears welled in his eyes. Not for himself, not even for the institution, but for his son, Harry. He could already imagine his face, his confusion, his fury. The boy who had already lost so much, his mother, his military life, his home within the royal family, was now about to lose something even more devastating. The belief that the child he'd loved and protected wasn't his. Charles thought of Diana again, of how she had fought for her children, of how she had endured the cold machinery of royal protocol for the sake of love. What would she say if she knew this? Would she blame him for letting it happen? Or would she simply shake her head and say what she always did when truth cut too deep? You can't hide from it forever, Charles. He rose slowly from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, London was quiet, its streets glistening under a thin veil of rain. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, people were laughing, living, oblivious to the storm about to break. He thought about calling William. He thought about calling Harry. But what would he say? Son, the child you've raised, the boy the world calls a prince, he's not yours. No, he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he picked up the phone and called Margaret Havers, his private secretary. Margaret, he said quietly, his voice heavy. It's done. The results are in. There was a pause. And he swallowed hard. Negative. The silence on the other end was long. When Margaret finally spoke, her tone was solemn. What would you like me to do, Your Majesty? Charles hesitated. He looked down at the letter again, at the cold numbers that had the power to turn blood into betrayal. Lock it away. For now. No one is to see it. Understood. He hung up, his hands shaking slightly. Then he folded the document, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it inside a small mahogany box, the same box that once held the Queen's private correspondence during the